Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to another Skyscraper interview here. I'm Brian Garrett Glazer, managing editor with eVTOL.com, and I am here with the man himself, Felipe Varon of Varon Vehicles. Felipe, thank you for joining us.
Hey Brian, how are you? It's great to be here with you. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to cover. It's hard to know where to start. But maybe we should start by, for me, reading about Varon Vehicles and all the work that you've done to begin building this ecosystem in Latin America for urban air mobility. One of the questions on my mind has been, okay, so what elements of it is Varon Vehicles looking to be involved in? Because there's so many aspects, there's such a large value chain here. My understanding, I think, is that Varon Vehicles is going to be an owner and potentially operator of infrastructure across Latin America. Is that the goal?
Yeah, that's true. And that's a great question to get started with because defining exactly what we're doing has been quite a task. And I appreciate that question. So, what we're doing is actually developing a new type of infrastructure. We're not reinventing any light bulbs in terms of the aviation and the operation in what entails urban air mobility. There's a lot of very capable companies that do that very well. For example, air vehicles. There's very capable air vehicle companies that not only work on the development design of their air vehicle models, but that are also capable of providing those fleets and running them through certification and able to eventually support the sustainability of those fleets. So that's just an example. Same goes for the airspace integration systems, right? There's very capable UTM systems, airspace design systems, and routing systems out there as well, and many others. So we're not reinventing any of those light bulbs. What we are indeed doing is bringing together all those players and stitching them together. There's a lot of integration that needs to happen in order for urban mobility to happen. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done both with the public and with the regulators. We are undertaking that task, and we've done so for several years now, working hand in hand with the civil aviation authorities, namely, for example, in the United States and in Colombia, especially as we move into integration of actual operation. So it's running all those components together, how to bring them to work in an integral way. That's the task that we've undertaken with a view of actually building a new type of mobility infrastructure. And that's a good difference right there. When we talk about infrastructure in our own vehicles, we're not talking about the vertiports. We are talking about urban air mobility itself. Our vertiports are a part, a component of that infrastructure. Our air vehicle fleets are a part, a component of that infrastructure. It's urban air mobility seen as infrastructure itself.
Well, I want to talk more about that new type of infrastructure, but first let's go back to Latin America as a whole, and thinking about these various markets for urban air mobility. I think a lot of people now, as here we are, and toward the end of 2020, there's been tremendous progress in the last few years on the aircraft and also on the other elements of these systems. People are beginning to realize, I think, that urban air mobility will be a reality in the near future, and they're trying to understand where it's going to crop up first and what markets are most appealing. We've seen a lot of progress in, with Uber and various markets in the US, Vancouver in Canada, and there's projects throughout Europe and a couple cities in Asia as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about why Latin America is such a good market for urban air mobility, and maybe more specifically, tell us a little more about what regions, what cities are great first applications, and or I should say first locations, and what those applications look like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long road to define where to make our implementation. We are a U.S. company, but we had to choose where to implement our systems, whether it was going to be in the United States, in Europe, or in Latin America. We are originally from Colombia, our team is, but we really looked into that question. We crunched a lot of numbers for a long time. And we finally decided on Latin America. And it's because there's a whole bunch of advantages in doing that here. One of them is the cost, right? There's a real advantage in terms of the availability of very qualified labor in many different fronts in Latin America at a very different cost level than in the United States or Europe. But actually, the most important reason was the problem. You see, the mobility problem in the developing world in general, but in Latin America especially, it's a very critical problem. There's a whole bunch of layers that we don't see in the developed world, in the United States and in Europe, that we do see in Latin America and that affect everybody's quality of life in a very deep manner. And we're not only talking about the layer, the traffic layer, that means the loss of time that we do see in the developed world, but also layers like very high pollution levels. Actually, cities in Colombia had to be closed in 2019 before we even had a pandemic, before we even knew these confinements, because of the pollution levels. And a big part of that comes from the mobility, activity of life. There's layers like criminality, for example. Unfortunately, in Latin America, there is that layer in the mobility that affects people's quality of life every single day. Layers like the lack of proper mobility infrastructure, government's systematic incapability to provide the needed infrastructure for city growth to alleviate that pressure of traffic. So, and there's other layers like the incapability to maintain the existing infrastructure and so on. And all these layers amount to a very tremendous problem. Probably one of the first priority problems in people, in countries, in cities in Latin America. So that problem is what we see as a tremendous opportunity for urban mobility. Here we come along and we say, we have a new type of infrastructure. It's a new way to move. We will only need to build vertiports here and there inside the existing urban structures, some of them outside of the existing urban structures, and then we'll generate connectivity. Because when you fly, you don't need to build any roads or railroads. And that's a gigantic leap right there, especially when you have those tremendous mobility problems as we do in Latin America. So we see the value that we can bring to a region in Latin America with that new type of mobility. So the need is there. That's why we're getting so much support from governments like the Colombian governments. There's Civil Aviation Authority, because everybody feels the need to have new solutions. We're not saying that urban mobility is going to be the solution, let alone replace ground vehicles. Not at all. Far from that. It's going to complement other modes of transportation. But the value that we can bring is tremendous. And let me add one more thing here to that question, which is very important. It's the simplicity in which we can implement urban mobility in this part of the world as compared to the developed world. Let me give an example here, Brian. For example, the city of San Francisco, just a usual suspect in the US for urban mobility. Over there, we would need to fly somewhere between 50 or 60 miles between vertiports to actually achieve providing a value to mobility. Now you look at cities in Latin America. Let's look at cities like Bogota or Lima or Medellin, Panama City, Santiago de Chile. All these cities, if you take a look, they don't measure more than some 16 miles across. And it turns out that these cities are amongst the worst in mobility in the world. If you look at the rankings, for example, Bogota is the city in the world where you waste more hours stuck in traffic, 272 according to last year's INRX ranking. So in order for urban air mobility to add a value in these cities, we would need to fly much shorter legs between vertiports, probably 4, 6, 8, maybe 10 miles at the most. So what's the difference there in terms of requirements for performance to all the systems that are involved in urban mobility, right? Performance on the air vehicles, on sense and avoid, the speed that we need to fly at, the altitude that we need to fly at. How does their airspace integration architecture need to be here compared to the US when you have much longer distances and probably much higher altitudes, much more congested airspaces too. So to summarize, it's the simplicity with which we can conceive urban air mobility in Latin America that really, really attracts us to come here, because it's much easier to start with and at a much lower cost.
Yeah. So I just want to throw out, I don't know if everybody would agree with you on the numbers that you cited earlier about, providing value in a city like San Francisco. I think that, Uber and others are very much focused on this or I should say intra-city model of just moving a few miles. So I don't think that's unique. But I certainly understand your point and agree. The availability of existing infrastructure is a huge determinant in the value of urban air mobility. And a lot of people talk about Elroy Air, Saberwing, these companies that are looking to develop vehicles to move cargo around the world. They're targeting markets where there is not existing infrastructure because there's a massively different value proposition there. So that certainly makes sense. I think you also mentioned in terms of simplicity, which is a point that makes perfect sense to me. But talking about the governments, you said you've been working for quite a while with the government of Colombia. Have you been working with other governments in Latin America as well, or at this point is it just mostly Colombia?
We have chosen to get started in Colombia, not only because we are Colombian in origin and we know the country, but there's a tremendous potential for business cases to get started.
Yeah.
And again, urban mobility, it's something that's going to be implemented in a very gradual way.
Yeah.
For example, the city of Cartagena, you were asking about cities in Colombia. We're looking at Cartagena very, very closely. And to your previous point, actually, we're seeing such tremendous bottlenecks in existing mobility infrastructure in that city, where by placing vertiports in very close proximity to each other, we would definitely add a tremendous value to mobility. Let me cite some data here. City of like Bogota, for example, there's a city that if you wanted to go and do the entire trip from bottom to the other extreme of the city, that's something that would probably take you 2.5, maybe 3 hours at peak hours of the day if you were to drive. And not to mention that you would need to drive through parts of the city you probably wouldn't want to. But in doing that via the air, that's something that would probably take you some 15 or so minutes. And there's a huge value right there. And let me go back to the example in Cartagena. There's places in Cartagena where you will want to move probably less than a mile or close to just 1 mile. But in peak hours and in high season, those are trips that will probably take you an hour, right? Because of the bottleneck. It's so tremendous that's a very attractive location, for example, to get started with very, very reduced requirements on the air vehicles and all the other systems in urban mobility. But of course, we're not only reflecting on the air taxi application. That's something we tend to go to usually, but there's a whole set of other applications. And let me refer to the one that we really like a lot in Colombia, which is tourism. Sightseeing applications, for example. Cartagena is one of those cities that you definitely would want to see from the air. Such a beautiful location, the old city, that it's a very attractive business case just staring at us right there below our noses. So transportation between islands. We talk about things, for example, like sightseeing in the Amazon, right? We have very beautiful natural parks that would be highly attractive to clean, silent types of new ways of sightseeing applications in tourism. So you see, it's all these things put together that attract us to Latin America.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. I think people underestimate the margins. I think the margins are going to be a little bit smaller than people think in terms of successfully operating here. And so having locations where, the amount of time that you're saving people is like measured in hours rather than minutes certainly makes a lot of sense. But what I was hoping to ask you is how have those conversations with the Colombian government gone so far? What is it like to work with them? How open are they to not only allowing some experimentation in urban air mobility, but to really considering this something that can become an integral part of transportation networks?
Yeah, precisely because of the problem that I described earlier, we have achieved to work very closely with the Colombian Civil Aviation Authority. And you can see that right here in Skyscraper. You can see all the support that they are reflecting on not only our company, but all of this ecosystem and this initiative of urban mobility. And it's a real thing. And they are very interested not only in looking into it, not only in considering it, but we have been working on this for several years already. We are developing an airspace integration architecture together with the Colombian CAA, an architecture that allows us to start in a safe way. And that architecture probably reflects a lot of Next Gen 1.0 CONOPS in the terms of the simplicity. And it's probably a simpler way of seeing that CONOPS. And one of the things that's quite unique, it's the fact that we are working with them around segregated airspaces that link vertiports. so that we guarantee that no other aircraft will mix with urban air mobility traffic. So that low, congestion airspaces that we do have in Colombia allows us to do such things and allows us to work with the Civil Aviation Authority in designing these airspace volumes to separate urban air mobility traffic from the traditional aviation traffic, at least to start with. And that has been something very, very attractive, because as long as we don't interfere with traditional aviation, as long as we don't burden ATC, we have a green light. We're good to go. The huge problem requires a need.
So, on that point,
solution, though, I'm sorry to that. Yeah.
No, I understood. On that point, though, I wonder if there's been resistance from traditional aviation on that, because I know, looking at the U.S., you referenced FAA's, concept of operations that they're putting out. I've spoken to, the AOPA and some other organizations that represent general aviation and existing operators in the space, and they're not. They express, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but they express some concern about the separation approach, because they don't want to restrict the amount of airspace that is accessible to existing, aviation operators in the space. So has there been any resistance to taking an approach that leans so heavily on segregation of airspace?
That's a great point for you to bring up, and I appreciate it very much, because no, we have not seen that resistance at all. Actually, the contrary. Listen, there's a good anecdote that we had in Colombia, a good experience to learn from, and it was the intent that there was a few years back to implement an urban air mobility system with helicopters in the city of Bogota, basically to replicate what is being very, very traditional in cities like Mexico City and Sao Paulo, where you have corporate type of transportation with helicopters in the city. Yeah. Now, that was tried in Bogota, and there were several reasons why that didn't work. But one of the main reasons why that was not successful was public acceptance. The public actually fought against it. They opposed that system. Yeah. And that's a huge lesson that we really go back to continuously to try to learn from. And actually, some of the partners that we have in Varon Vehicles are the ones who put that system up in the first place. And we are seeing that this new type of aviation, these new types of aircraft, can actually achieve what helicopters could not in terms of public acceptance, in terms of the perception of safety, because of noise levels and other factors. So one very important factor, it's the massification of that service, the fact that we're not targeting a service for just a few or corporate or a group of VIPs at all. We're targeting to provide a new type of infrastructure, and that's a different approach. Yeah. That means that as we move forward and we become more and more economically efficient, we may be able to service more and more people. So that's a big difference, yes.
So will that be enough, though? Will the attributes of these new vehicles, the fact that they are safer and that they have less of an environmental footprint and an acoustic footprint on cities, will that be enough to turn public opinion in favor of accepting this type of a system, versus, like you mentioned, just a couple of years ago, a similar helicopter service not really finding footing in Bogota? Because, I think that we all want to see that end results system, whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, where there is a urban air mobility system that is, I think, I really do believe that we will get to a point where that system is economically viable for a lot more than the type of people that use helicopters today. But it's going to take years to get there, and it's going to be a very incremental process of reaching the production rates of these aircraft that we're hoping to reach, introducing the autonomy systems that we're hoping to introduce, and getting to the point where the cost really comes down to that point. And that leaves like a 5, 10, I don't know how many years window in time where these services are likely not going to be available to the masses, where people may very much not see it as something that is beneficial to their life and decide to resist it. So I go back to my initial question after ranting for a little bit here. I apologize. Will the improvements in noise and safety provided by these vehicles be enough to achieve a public acceptance in a city like Bogota, where people did not accept a helicopter service?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think they're part of the reason why we do see this as something that is going to change the status quo in terms of urban mobility, and that helicopters could not. And it's not just only that. You see, there's an intrinsic nature in these vehicles that allow us to see that future, and it's the simplicity. We're doing away with a lot of complexity in traditional aviation, mechanical complexity, hydraulic systems. All these tend to disappear with these new types of aircraft. When we, as I was saying in my intro speech for Skyscraper, as we transition from mechanical complexity into systems complexity and software, basically. So the cost of the air vehicles are a big part of it. But not only that, I just want to add on top of what you said, which is exactly the reason why, that there are other reasons, and it's that this is a new industry. This is not traditional aviation trying to provide the service. Actually, helicopters already try that and basically have failed. If you look at it from the bigger picture, right, perspective, it's the fact that this is a new industry overall. This is not the aviation industry necessarily, and this is probably not even the automotive industry if you look at it from the flying car perspective. But it does tend to be more leaning towards the mobility side than to the air side, urban mobility in terms of generality. So you have to look at other factors. You have to look at factors, for example, of the need, what the needs are. And again, the need is not only to move people around like air taxis. There are other needs in terms of infrastructure. For example, the environment. Let me just give you one example. The environment. How are we going to tackle all these internal combustion engine ground vehicles problem, right? Here we come with a new type of infrastructure that is probably going to be way more efficient, way cleaner. And we're saying we can intervene those logistics chains by moving cargo within our cities and outside in a new way, right? With this new means, with this new infrastructure. So that's a need that we can tackle right there. So that's a way for us to start proving to the public that this is something that actually can become very accepted. So that's a very interesting path, the environmental one. So, but it's the fact that this is a new industry is what I want to reflect on, where we can generate more employment. That's another one, another example. How many aircraft do we have flying in traditional aviation? Many talk about hundreds, but then again, when you talk about urban air mobility, those same people say we're going to probably be having thousands of air vehicles in urban air mobility. In other words, way larger numbers. So how are we going to tackle that as an opportunity to provide more employment? Let me talk about the operators. Who are the operators of our air vehicles going to be? Are they going to be the traditional pilots that need all those hours of training? Or are they going to be a different type of operator? Now, these technologies that we're talking about in eVTOLs and the intrinsic nature of these air vehicles allows us to think about operators that can have less training, much less burden, and eventually to remove them overall from the air vehicles way down the line. We have to overcome many cultural and public acceptance barriers before we do that. But over the years, as you are saying, we are headed that way. And higher levels of automation do allow us to think that these operators are going to be people from our more common, workforce. So that means more employment opportunities. And as we bring the community more into urban mobility, into this new industry, well, we push forward on that public acceptance. So there's a whole host of different reasons why seeing urban mobility as infrastructure and as an entirely new industry do allow us to think about something that can achieve acceptance long-term, where traditional aviation was not able to.
Out of curiosity, have you engaged with any of the actors or organizations that sort of put to bed the Bogota helicopter experiment?
Yeah, they're actually part of our team.
The ones that caused that to not work?
Well, the ones who tried it, yeah, who tried it in the first place and built the business case, yeah.
No, what I'm saying is the people who resisted that effort.
Well, that was the community in general. There was no one organization. That was not one entity. Okay. The community in general was, what people oppose, and this is openly recognized, right, about helicopters, and not only in Colombia, but I mean, you can look at the case in New York and in many places in the world. It's the high impact, the footprint that helicopters pose in terms of, the big rotor, the downwash. You talk about, of course, the noise. So there's one thing is the safety per se, but an entirely different thing, but equally important, is the perception of safety. Yeah. So the public did oppose those to be implemented right within their urban scenario. Yeah.
Helicopters have a very, they're not as safe as passenger airliners, but more importantly, like you said, the perception of their safety is an entirely different story. What can you tell us about what is in store for Varon vehicles and Latin America UAM efforts in 2021?
Oh, that's great. We're very happy to be hosting our first summit here and to have this interview and all this other content for everybody to watch anytime they want permanently. That's something that excites us very much because we are opening the doors of our ecosystem for all the different players globally to come and see and be part of what we're doing. So that number one is our first milestone for this year, but moving forward towards 21 and then the following years, our plans are really focused on implementation. We are really targeted at undergoing the first plans to deploy in Colombia, to get started in first integration efforts, first test efforts. And it's not about the different components, because those are really there. For example, the vertiport designs, your vehicles, the subsystems, powertrains, flight computers, all these different components of air mobility, they're basically there. What we see is a need to start integrating them, having one talking to the other, and seeing how the designer and developer of an air vehicle can talk with the designer and developer of a vertiport, how we can have mobility experts and city urban planners talk to the airspace integration people, and how we can have that integration started and happening. And that's why our think tanks and Skyscraper is really important for us. So that's what we're moving forward into. Implementation, that means conformance testing, not only testing air vehicles and other systems for the sake of testing them, but testing them as they conform to our airspace integration architecture and the entire urban air mobility ecosystem that we're devising in Colombia as we move forward into placing into service. So it's all that work. That's a long road ahead. We definitely need to walk before we run, and then we need to we need to crawl before we walk, and then walk before we run, right? And for us, crawling means that first stage that we are in right now, integration, testing, exhibiting, and generating that public acceptance as we work into actual implementation. But then walking for Varon vehicles means freight. We are very, very sure that we'll be probably moving packages and boxes before we move any people, right? And then we get into run. And running means passenger transportation. All that, whole host of different applications and potential business cases with passenger movement that I mentioned before. So we're right now in this crawl phase. And that means very exciting news that we hope to be bringing forward to everybody as we move into 2021.
Fantastic. All right, Felipe Varon, thank you very much for all this work putting together the Skyscraper Summit, and look forward to speaking to you next year to hear more about those developments.
That's great, Ryan. Thanks a lot for this, and I appreciate it. Great to have you here. Thank you.